Well, welcome back everybody to the continuing real broadband discussion, as Mark Anderson has called it. We had a session like this in the last FiRe, and we've got Simon and Chris, I think, returnees to our discussion. We're going to have an actual global broadband review, but then we're going to look at one of the real leaders in this globally, Australia, and think a little bit about where we are in the U.S. compared to that. We're going to start with Phil Asmundson, who's the global telecom sector leader at Deloitte, and he's going to give us a global view. Then we're going to go to Simon Hackett, who's managing director of Internode and has been working with the internet in Australia since it really began. And then we're going to go to Chris Hancock, who's the CEO of AARNet, the Australian Research and Education Network, and then finally go to Peter Coroneos, who's the CEO of the Internet Industry Association in Australia. So we've got some incredibly experienced people here to talk about this. Now, for those of you, I don't know how many of you know about the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue, but for the last 17, 18 years, it has connected our two countries at the highest level. And in fact, they have a major meeting coming up in Washington, D.C. in July. And Phil Scanlon, who's the founder of that, has worked with Mark Anderson, and that's one reason that we have this intimate relationship with Australia. So Phil, I want to start with you. You actually have got deep experience all over the world, and we're seeing this explosion of fiber to the home starting at 100 megabit per second. How many of you have more than 10 megabit per second access delivered to your home? Okay, like 5%. Okay, tell us about the rest of the folks that have that.
Well, it's quite interesting. As you go around the globe, there seems to be some very common factors that are driving all of this, and it's nothing that's that unusual, except the sense of urgency has really risen. Broadband, to a large extent, has been looked at as kind of a very, ho-hum thing. It's kind of the dumb pipe, if you will, but that dumb pipe has suddenly become incredibly important. And it's become that way because of things like fiber to the home and suddenly being able to do things that we've never dreamed possible. Video being a tremendous user of what that broadband is going to be needed for in the home. But it extends way beyond the home. It's really the wireless side that I think has started to raise a lot of eyebrows. Once you have it to the home, now I want to have it wherever I am. I want it to start to do things for me, utility-wise. And that's been what we've seen to the rise of applications over the last few years, particularly with the smartphone coming along and the iPhone in particular, bringing out hundreds of thousands of applications that change, quite frankly, the utility model of what that device is all about. Add one other dimension to that I think really is starting to scare a lot of the governments around the world and the carriers, and that is the number of nodes that are now connected. It used to just be a phone or a home. It's no longer that anymore. And it's not just the iPad. It's things that Paul was just talking about, digital Band-Aids that are coming out, digital sportwear that firms like Nike are bringing out there, and all sorts of other things that you can just start to dream up that get connected. Anything that can create data is ultimately going to be connected.
So who are the leaders in, because we just had this great discussion about wireless and all that's coming, but in the fixed wire, Korea,
it's going to be a South Korea. It's going to be a Japan. Those would be the two biggest leaders. South Korea is at roughly a little over 50% of fiber to the home. Tremendous job that they've done. The government there is very adamant about trying to be a leader in that area. And there's smaller countries, countries like Qatar, that have basically sat there and made a boatload of money with their oil and have decided that this is a strategic advantage. And I think that's the key that countries are starting to notice. Broadband is a digital currency. It's a digital enabler that's going to change around their healthcare, change around how you buy, how you sell, how you educate, how you manage energy. And so countries like Qatar have been extremely aggressive in how they've gone after and said, we want to be a leader. In fact, we want to be the model that we want the rest of the world to look through. And through QTEL, they've been funding that to be purchased. big also difference as you go from country to country is what level of involvement does the government have in the local telcos? So in the United States, in the UK, where it's none, also in Australia, when they divested a number of years ago, it really has been zero. But you go to other countries like France, which has a very good penetration rate, where they own almost a third of France Telecom, and in Japan, of course, they have to own a third of NTT. So that's another variable that matters.
Well, and that's a tremendous lead in to Australia. I've been so impressed, many of you know I've worked with Australia over the last few years on what has now become probably the most comprehensive government program to put fiber to 90% of all of the homes, schools, businesses, and buildings in Australia. And it's being done to looking at 2050 and thinking about what is a platform that will make Australia totally competitive, free up all of its citizens to be able to essentially do global corporations out of their home using software services in the cloud and so forth. I was down in Tasmania in last August at the launch of this national broadband network, the NBN, which is starting to be rolled out in Tasmania. And then it'll go across the country in 8 years. Now, Simon, you've followed this very closely. How are they doing?
Yeah, they're doing pretty well, Larry. As you said, it's an 8-year project, maybe 10 years in realistic terms, and we're a year into it. Last year we were talking and it had just really been announced.
Right.
So I'll spend a minute explaining where it's got to in that year. The government's done a lot of things in parallel to try to get it moving, as you'd expect. In Tasmania, the first physical instance of the network is running. We'll be connecting, my company and others will be connecting real commercial customers to that network in June, in fact, next month. So that's starting to happen to demonstrate that it works and to learn things. There's been a really large implementation study done by McKinsey that just came in to help inform the government of how to do this right. And it's a very detailed study, $25 million, 500-page study, so $50,000 a page, nice work if you can get it. But it's arguably worth a reasonable fraction of that. It's really, but not all of it. It's reasonably informed the process of what settings the government need to get right to get this to happen. And what's important to appreciate, apart from ramping up a company in Australia called NBN Co that the government wholly own to drive that process, and that's busy hiring hundreds of people and setting up structures for it, I just want to mention a couple of things that have been learned so far. One of them's kind of obvious. It's all about access price for consumers today. In 10 years' time, it'll be all about the speed and the access they need. Today, to get them across, it's all about price. So the network needs to have an entry-level cost point that is not higher than what people currently pay, or there'll be no take-up. That led to a really big statement in the implementation study, and something that to me was always obvious, which is the government are actually going to have to foot the bill to build this network entirely up front. They started out thinking they could get a combined business, commercial and government investment. They've realised that the rate of return won't be high enough during the deployment years for that to make sense. So the government are footing the bill to build it. Once it's built, they will ultimately wind up privatising it once it's got take-up and it's got return and it's got stability. And that's important. And I guess, but the deep thing is, as a comparison point for the US for this network, is that in the US, fibre networks are vertically integrated, geographically specific monopolies. So a given provider lays fibre in a given place, they own that, soup to nuts. And if you don't like that provider, well, that's too bad. This network is the precise kind of 90-degree angle version of that. The government are paying for it, it's going to be ubiquitous nationally, and access to it will be provided on the same basis to all retail service providers of broadband services. So in a funny way, that information superhighway we used to talk about as the sort of description of the internet, the Australians are actually building it, like the real one that doesn't just go past out in the distance, but it's going to come all the way to your home. That consistency of access, it's really important. It makes it kind of like the iPhone of networking. When you write an application to run on that network, you know the speed is there. That's actually revolutionary.
Yeah, you've actually got you've got an iPhone as big as the United States.
Yeah, you've got a substrate to
rely on.
rely
You've got this platform, and it's open to everybody to compete on. I mean, for us in developing countries like the United States, we can only dream of a day where we would have the leadership and vision and the government that you've had in Australia that could get us to such a place. That's why I keep going back to Australia to see how the future will be. So it's incredibly impressive and courageous, I think, move. Now, but it gets better. So how do you future-proof something like this? I mean, you know, just to put it in perspective, this is the largest infrastructure project in Australia's history, $45 billion. Now, there's as many people that live in Australia as in Southern California. So it's 1/12 of the US population. So if you do it on per capita, we would have had to be putting in something like $600 or $700 billion. And in the stimulus, what did we put in for broadband? Instead of 700 billion, 7. So we're putting in 1% of the national investment as Australia. Where's that going to leave us in 10 years? So in addition to that, the Australian, the Advanced Research and Education Network, AARNet, that Chris Hancock is the CEO of, that's 5 to 10 years out ahead of the national broadband. And that links to all the universities and the advanced government research labs that CSIRO has. And so it's like the locomotive future-proofing this entire national investment. So Chris, tell us a little bit about, you know, some of the future-looking things that you're doing and some of I mean, we talk about big data, right? Mm-hmm. You know big data with the SKA. Tell them a little bit about the kind of thing that's coming.
Oh, well, absolutely, Larry. I think just walking around having coffee with people, there's a number of people that don't know about AARNet or research networks because we're the equivalent of Internet 2 or NLR, if that makes sense in the US. And
National Lambda Rail.
National Lambda Rail. And basically, a crude way of describing us is we're a white space network. So the stuff we do can't be done over commercial networks because there's just too much data, too much flow through. But that allows us to, being owned by the universities, which is the hub of where people like Simon came from originally, the supercomputing schools, etc., driving innovation, driving change, and they're our shareholders and our customers. We also link, of course, schools, hospitals, and colleges, etc., and culture institutions, but that's deliberate to feed into the institutions themselves. And I think that we've got a 10 gigabit backbone and we're looking down the gun barrel of 100 gig very shortly. But if you look at some of the projects, as Larry talks about, they either need high data throughput over very short periods of time, real-time collaboration, which is really important. And for some of you who've been to this conference before, you would have been to Larry's labs to see OptiPortals and to see the stuff. Well, Larry's preached that word with us out there, and they're really having take-up in Australia, but they need the bandwidth that a research network can give them. But to relate it back to this NBN, it's fascinating because the comparison I make, at the moment, the average home, about 50% of homes in Australia are getting between 1 and 8 meg. So if you said 1 meg or 2 meg to a home in Australia, the researcher in Australia is getting at the moment from AARNet between 1 and 10 gig. So what's this 5 years out thing mean? By the time that the NBN is complete, and 90% of homes are at 100 megabits per second, will be at about 100 to 200 gig to the researcher, okay? Now, that gives you that sort of time span in terms of where we're working. Now you say, well, you know, why is that important? Well, if you know anything about some of the projects going on around the world, a Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, transporting terabytes of data around the world to our physics community. But the big project that ourselves and South Africa are vying for at the moment is a square kilometre array, which will be the biggest science project ever. And in the lead up to that, both countries have developed what I would call mini SKAs, and an SKA being an array of telescopes and the bigger the array, the bigger the aperture or the coverage area. And interestingly, South Africa and Australia are in that zone because look at our geography and look at where the location of this is, and it's very remote from a noise perspective, an interference perspective, but that's going to mean an enormous change for whoever wins that. Even if Australia doesn't win that, we're doing a junior project that's called the Pathfinder project, and that's 36 dishes times 190 times 10 gig per dish. Okay, so we're talking, look at the map of Australia, look at where our population is, and right across the middle, it will be initially 36 dishes. If we're successful, it'll go to about 5,000 and across to New Zealand. So we're talking about an enormous scale project and something that you require, obviously, big pipes, real-time, low latency, etc., to be able to do the things you're going to do. And the astronomy community already, there's 600 astronomers around the world that would book space if it was ready today.
So when Chris says big pipe, he means terabit per second. That's 1 million megabits a second compared to the 1 or 2 megabits per second you get at your home. 1 million times that. And that's in the engineering requirements, blueprints, right? So it's amazing. So Peter, Australia seems to be perfect. Are there any bumps in this beautiful story as far as you see?
I hate to be the person to rain on the parade. I should put this in context. I mean, clearly we're delighted. We're the National Trade Association. Companies like Simon's and Chris's are members of ours, and quite a few multinationals that may be represented here. So we're active in the policy space, and of course in being one of the voices calling for the NBN back in about 2006. We said, this is a project that the country is crying out for. We need what we call a nation-building approach in the nature of dam building and the big infrastructure projects of America, things that would never occur through private sector investment alone. And to their credit, the government rose to the challenge, and we've now got this project underway. So that's the good news story, and I mean, this is proceeding afoot. Unfortunately, also in the policy space, however, we have a couple of problematic issues that we think take a little bit of the shine off this project, and we really hope we can get them resolved before the project, the NBN, is live and up and running. The one that you may have been reading about recently is with all the right intentions, but the government's proposal to institute a form of web censorship in Australia. How many of you have been reading about that? Yeah.
How many of you heard about China? But do you think about Australia when you hear that?
It seems hard to believe, but for whatever the reasons, and I won't go into them now, we have an official government policy and in fact legislation that's currently being drafted to require every ISP in Australia to have a capability to accept an encrypted list of URLs that Australians won't be able to access. And again, we don't criticise the intention of the government, but we are very concerned about both the implementation of this, not only from a cost standpoint, but certainly from an efficiency standpoint, will it actually protect us in the way that it's being promised to do. But most importantly of all, I think, given the nature of the internet and how it's evolved, we're very concerned about the signals it sends about Australia as a jurisdiction not unlike the US, a liberal Western democracy, now moving down the path in a direction that we would criticise other jurisdictions for doing. And of course, you'd be aware of Google's recent statements about China. So I think this is a very problematic, thorny issue for us. One of the things that we are doing is working with our American colleagues to see whether we can get the message back to our government. And to that end, if there's anyone here that can help us with that mission, we really need to get that message through that the internet, by its design, by its nature, needs to remain open. And if we create a precedent here, not only are we a precedent for ourselves, but we are potentially a precedent for the rest of the region. And then you start to get into an area that could look very different from the internet that we know and love.
Well, I think in the breakout session today on this topic, what the net neutrality controversy going on in the United States, there's a lot of room for more discussion. So I'm hoping those of you who are engaged in thinking about this will join the group here in that breakout. One of the things that's been fascinating to me is because of the prior investments in having these fiber optics nets, you'll remember, many of you who came to Cal IT2 I can't remember, it was 1 or 2 years ago, we had this live link up with Australia using high definition. And in fact, this coming week, I'll be giving a guest lecture to Monash University in Melbourne in Victoria as just part of our normal way of doing things. We have a joint Victoria and California are both challenged by wildfires and water in similar ways. So we're actually developing a joint effort, and we have all these high definition links back and forth between each other. So the collaboration that begins to occur is something that Australia has always suffered from, is this tyranny of distance, they call it in Australia. How do you see the NBN, changing that? I mean, in a way now, you've got anybody from their home will have at least 10 times the bandwidth of what people in the U.S. have to, anywhere else in the world. How is that going to change a continent that has been so physically isolated for so long?
Well, I think as a continent, it makes us look for ways to overcome that isolation, and clearly that's an important one. And one of the things that we're used to, you and I and Chris et al. Are used to working in the fibre realm also, is that bandwidth is symmetric. And one of the big shifts from the capacity most people have at home, whether it's cable or ADSL, is that's really quite, the downstream speed is what we talk about, but the upstream speed is typically very, very small. You've actually got symmetric bandwidth in fibre, and that makes an enormous difference, because the big screen television in your home can receive this stuff, but in a fibre network it can also send it. And now suddenly every lounge room is a telepresence location or a place you can monitor something else from, and it's really quite transformative.
Right, and in fact we're working with Cisco with the National Lambda Rail Internet 2 to start putting Cisco telepresences all over the place, and we're looking forward to taking our telepresence that we've got at Cal 82 and linking it up in Australia. So Chris, you've worked with a lot of different kinds of collaboration technologies in Australia. How are you seeing the take-up now, people beginning to use this?
Yeah, I think, believe it or not, Cisco are really are trying to extend the same arrangements to us in Australia, so that's a really good thing. But it gets back to the discussions we've heard about video being one of the key apps and the sorts of things that have been talked about up here previously to this session. And I think it was the last session or the one before that where we talked about the video wall. And, if you've seen the stuff at Cal-IT2 regarding OptiPortals, well, that's, symptomatic of where we're going. And I think it's just not at one level though. Telepresence is fine, but we're doing things at the desktop level where there's more mobility, and people are wanting, or researchers at least, are wanting to collaborate and have one-to-many type connections rather than point-to-point. And you'll see a lot of those developments happen in the next year with Skype audio quality. They'll be, really sharp, and it'll help enormously in that process, because whoever said it in the previous session before, it stuck in my mind that it's a bit like looking at the laptop now and you see someone next to them using the iPad. The laptop sort of starting to look a bit, but the same's going to happen for those video rooms, as much as I think the telepresence technology just gets taken, along with what we're doing with OptiPortal walls, and then you start to get into these are part of structures, and you don't need to build them as separate freestanding things that allow that to happen. So, because we are so far away, that's the downside. The upside is, as Simon said, it makes us want to play harder to get there, and we link to all the research networks around the world and do light paths around the world, etc. But the ability to drive that even into the home is going to be our challenge. I think the one thing I'd say about the NBN, Larry, is that it's been a great vision, and it's the right vision, and as a building project it's no bigger. Now the building part of it is the bit we're subsumed with, but the other part everyone's asking is, gee, tell me about these applications. Why do I need why does my son need 100 megabits when he never comes out of his room with 2, So, believe it or not, this crowd can't understand that comment, but that's been some of the pushback on all of that. And I think, that's why health, education, all the things you talked about originally are really important to start to galvanise and crystallise. And at a conference like this, having people up talking about vast different businesses, it all dovetails. It's, not about the pipes here.
I think, Larry, one of the other points about that is that this transition from scarcity to abundance in bandwidth takes the video walls and the screens that you can use for this interaction from scarcity to abundance. Right. Today in our organisation we have telepresence screens between offices, and you head off down the corridor to the holy citadel of the telepresence room, and there's some specialness about that actually needs to go away. And also it actually becomes a scarce resource. It doesn't want to be a scarce resource, it wants to be every screen in the building, every screen in the house capable of that.
Right. Well, all of these dead walls,
precisely.
all over. I mean, 100 million buildings in the U.S. with dead walls everywhere instead of electroactive walls. That is going to change, and that will change everything. Phil, you know, this Australian model is really pretty radical in a way, although it's what I think of Dwight Eisenhower having done to with the interstate highway system that set the United States off on this incredible growth path for the last 60 years. How do you see it as a strategic investment, you know, of a country?
I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I know a little bit about it, but obviously I need to learn a little bit more about what I've heard today. I think they're doing it the right way. You know, I think, Chris, it was you who mentioned the fact that when you first started on this venture, it is a government-owned backing, and you tried to get some private guys to come in, and they backed away because the ROI just wasn't there.
Right.
Look at what I wouldn't say they failed. In fact, I think they've done well in the U.S. is Verizon.
Right.
But look at the criticism they got by the financial public when asked, what are you going to put over this broadband fiber network? And they kind of said, we don't know, stuff. And that didn't work in the financial markets. But the government taking the advantage and some risk on that, and having a forward view of how we were going to use this thing in many, many ways. It's a model that should be followed. I think it's something that's not the same as what's been done in South Korea.
Well, I love this analogy between the iPhone and the NBN because, you know, it took a genius like Steve Jobs to say, for people who were thinking this thing was a telephone, and he said, no, it's a platform. And instead of the Telecom owning it, I'm going to own it. And that's going to turn the whole business model of the world upside down. And to me, that's sort of the level. I mean, you know, Peter, let's have one last question, and we'll open it up for questions. Anybody has questions, come on up to the mic. But, I mean, do you see this as you know, take all the companies that would be writing applications, all the companies that can now not have the capital expense of having to get pipes in the home, they can just do services. So sort of that service approach. How do you see that turning on your companies and in your association?
Yeah, it's a game changer. There's no question. And I think this is, you know, part of the pitch to government those years ago was, I mean, because I guess it's hard being in the industry. We're so close to the issues that I think we just get this because, A, we've got a lot of faith in it. We've been using it for a long time ourselves. But we see the potential. And the hurdle that we've had to bridge here is to get the political decision makers to make that bet, even in the absence of any demonstrable business case. And it's all around this ecosystem that we want to try and create as a nation. I mean, we've seen it in the social media, companies like Facebook and you know, the iTunes store, great examples of, you know, build it and they will come. Right. This is the same kind of idea, is that everyone is a creator. The idea of symmetry and bandwidth is, I think, key to this.
Yeah, it is.
That's really how
it's a pretty boring teleconference when one side has 10 times the bandwidth in one direction as the other. Yeah. You know, it's hard to have a symmetric conversation. So I think it's going to be a lot of change. Yeah, question. Scott.
Yeah, I'm Scott Gardner. I was just, in fact, looking up what Google's status is. I was thinking about the parallels with what they're trying to do. They're basically trial running this 100x bandwidth to these different communities around the country, and they've had a contest to see who could get that. And I was shocked when I found out some little town in southeast Kansas, not the part where the solar panels are, but the other side, they actually have bid on this, and it's just 25,000 people in the middle of nowhere. And all of a sudden, that's kind of what you're talking about. You're just bringing all this bandwidth to some area, and they're going to have to figure out what to do with it.
Can I comment on that? Because I think one of the things we haven't talked about, and I think it'll come for the US as well, in terms of our geography, we go on in Australia about how arid and how the population is only 20 odd million, and but it's the same, almost the same size as the US, etc. But one of the clever things that the government have also embarked on and said, here's this wonderful vision, this big project, but by the way, we need some emergency surgery. And they've got a program called Black Spots. So they've taken 250 million of that money and they've said there are still things and we want to fix them now. And they're not marginal seats, they're not, it's not politically driven as such. These are known black spots by most of the guys on this stage and everyone in the industry. And that's really important because it gets that instant hit where we say, we're starting to build in Tassie and we're starting to build in this demonstration site in North Queensland and they've never had, any broadband, etc. And so that gets the train moving, if you know what I mean.
No, I was so impressed, in Tasmania. I mean, Tasmania is sort of like doing this in Kentucky or something in the U.S., but there's a lot of people who would love to. Tasmania is beautiful, and it's 80% energy comes from hydro, so it's already there in alternative energy. And now you can go there and people say, well, I can't go there because I can't run my business. Now they've got companies going to put data centers there, all kinds of things, and live there. So people can begin to live where they want and still run their business. Last question.
There's another person over there too.
We're running out of time. Go ahead.
I think you were first.
Either one.
Yeah. Hank Rogers, Avatar Reality. I was on the broadband task force for the state of Hawaii, and we worked together and we came up with this big suggestion about how to do it. And it's sort of like sitting there because the politicians just don't get it. So what was the thing that gave you critical mass in Australia to be able to convince your politicians to take a visionary approach to the problem?
I think it was a bit of luck. We did have a change in government 3 years ago. Previous government, we tried all these arguments as well and pretty much hit the wall time and again. But I think we've got to give credit to the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd. They criticise him, they call him a geek. But I think this guy actually, he's the first Prime Minister we've ever had that's got a computer on his desk. He actually gets this. He is actually a digital kind of guy. And I think it's really getting the people in those positions that understand this. Because I think to go to someone that has no background in this and no real feeling for it, it is a really hard way to go. The only thing we could have done, I guess, had we continued the way we were going was really demonstrate. You've got to show them what the future is going to look like. But I think Kevin already understood that.
I think the other bit is, there's one other bit, and that's embarrass yourself into it almost. We weren't on the OECD tables, right? On the top 15. Now it's South Korea at the top, and etc. And we're still climbing up there. And I think there was a feeling of national pride from even when the previous government were in, which said, we better do something about this. We're a long way away, and there's the evidence.
Well, thank you very much.